The books were just backups. The original documents and transcripts were still in the terminal at the City Hall, now moved to the surface. As for the paper pages, anything could have happened to those. Mold, a dinner accident, a bratty child, you name it. In a society this small, there were not many places closed off to the public, so some destruction was bound to happen. It felt good to think clearly again. Nature had not wasted the 2 decades of colonists' absence on the surface. The civic buildings in Zelem barely resembled human-made houses, what with their walls overgrown by sprawling, grubby plants. Some roofs even spotted blossoming clusters. The City Hall, where the terminal was, lay at the end of the little alley. Nevene snuck past a wandering colonist, sparing no more than a furtive glance and a half-nod, making sure there would be no words between them. Yet his hopes of getting to the terminal mostly unnoticed were dashed when he entered the building and saw an old man resting there with his legs up on the coffee table. "Afternoon," the man said. His form was flickering, as they usually did in Nevene's eyes. Losing its opacity, partially phasing in and out of existence, the man seemed a ghost, a spectre of some kind, only somewhat here. Ever since Nevene's brain had begun to alter the reality, the only person he saw as properly human was Viveka. "Afternoon," he replied in kind. The man was old, probably one of the oldest in Zelem. His arthritis-bound fingers clutched an empty mug. It was probably easier to hold on to it than to set it down. When his body flickered transparent, Nevene filled in the parts of the bleak green sofa the form would normally obscure, much like a video editing software could complete the scene when the elements of it had been keyed out. Someone placed the terminal on the same coffee table the man's legs rested on. And no wonder. It was the only piece of furniture present in the little shack. The futuristic device looked out of place in the rundown building, making Nevene feel once more as if not much kept the colony from traveling back in time a good few centuries. The man watched him, as if he expected Nevene to state some business of his, and frankly, the elder could even be able to help. He'd been here since the colony's inception and might know more than the official records lurking in the machine. Nevene could ask. "Son," Viveka had told him, "they might have good intentions, sometimes, but they can and will still hurt you, because they don't understand us, and they never can." "Why not?" he'd asked. She shook her head and said only, "Keep your distance, never ask them for help, and never show them that you need them. You don't. Good intentions don't matter if you end up hurt." The man sighed and stretched. He put away the cup and said to Nevene, "All right then, I'll leave you to it." Nevene followed him out with his gaze and wondered. Even if he had asked, would the elder give him any answers? After all, Viveka hadn't. Faced with the terminal ready for use, brought back some of yesterday's anxiety. If there was no information about his father in here either, who's Nevene to be now? He fell to his knees in front of the computer, the couch awkwardly far from the table. The machine hummed, brought out of its slumber. With each passing second, Nevene was realizing just how key it was that he found the name there. He was losing the grip on his very identity, and the void it was leaving in its wake horrified him. He skimmed the screen for the search bar, but something else caught his eyes just as he found it. There were a few research documents lying around on the front screen, community-sourced ideas. One of them mentioned Viveka's field. What were they thinking about? Nevene opened the file and froze as his eyes darted across the letters, words, sentences, paragraphs. No. People, being humans, began to dream. It was no longer enough to have just a little colony under the dome. they wanted to venture out. First, move the flowers into their gardens, observe them, understand, test their limits. And then, of course, bring them outside, little by little, expanding the fields. No longer the Viveka's field for which she had given her life. No, merely countless echoes of it which soon forget the sound at their origin. The people believed, or maybe just hoped, based on rudimentary research, that the local ecosystem wouldn't collapse from it. Supposedly it would not. That was what the inside of the dome had showed. Life went on here, and it didn't seem to struggle. Of course, it could turn catastrophic on a large scale. But when had that ever stopped progress? Nevin's leg jerked as if he was physically struck on his knee. The power plug of the terminal flew out of the socket, and the machine died. Why couldn't the ideas written in the file be unplugged in the same way? The colony would never understand the field, comprehend the delicate balance within the flowers, the intricate design behind them. They said they revered Viveka's creation, but they were not willing to respect it. They wanted to own it, to make it theirs, shape it, mold it, so it could serve them. With Viveka gone, Nevene was the only one that could stop them from destroying the one thing that gave them the lives they craved. It was his gene, his bizarre, miraculous mutation that allowed the creation of the paper flowers. He was bound to the field, and it was his, not theirs. He rolled up his sleeve and brushed the glowing spots covering his forearm. The vaccination scars, shining like little constellations. Never feel inferior, son. These children are stupid and clueless, and so is their mockery. Remember that you are more valuable than any of them. You are a hero, and a part of you will make the world better for all of them one day. But don't resent them for their ignorance, don't hate them for it. That is not what heroes do. He had learned not to resent them for staring and judging his scars. He didn't resent them for the painful blood draws, nor for forgetting about him when he lay at home battling yet another fever spell. Not even for these dumb names the kids liked to give him when he tried to fit in. But right now, he found himself struggling not to feel hate towards the colonists. He would not allow these people to touch the field. One way or another, he would find a way to stop them. Nothing else mattered. It was only the urgent sense of purpose that made bearable the pain of a dozen tiny wooden spikes digging into Nevin's hands. He wondered sometimes if it was a splinter or a paper cut that had inspired the most dramatic stories of men winning over giants. For if a tiny, inanimate piece of wood in a digit could drive a man insane, surely a tiny man, armed with brains and brawn to boot, could fell a titan or two. One final tug, and another thick branch landed by Viveka's field. Nevene grabbed the axe and made quick work of splitting the wood in half. Dried old branches didn't fight overmuch against the blade. Thank goodness. Just carrying the logs and digging them into the ground around the field was enough to set Nevin's muscles on fire, and there was still so many missing before the fence would be complete. Of course, a fence of wood and wire wouldn't stop anyone determined from getting into the field. Nevene wasn't stupid. But it would deter them, tell them that they weren't wanted here, give him time to construct something more efficient. What it would be, he didn't yet know. One step at a time. One step at a time, he would figure it out. He would figure it out. He would. He tried to repeat this in his head like a mantra, but the anxiety was growing. So many horrifying concepts were shaping in his mind. He began to whisper these words to himself, but it was all for naught. His breath became shallow, heartbeat accelerated, and head got dizzy. Another panic attack was coming. He dropped the halved log where he stood and bolted into the field. He needed to get in, be surrounded by it, hide away the world, stop the time. He'd likely sit there for hours, giving in to the relief of scratching his legs and the serenity of the field's whispers, slowly clearing his mind and making room for useful ideas. There was a lot of equipment still in the temporary. Some of it usable in a surveillance system, maybe. But he wasn't given the time he needed to crystallize this thought. A sudden thump of wood hitting against wood had Nevin a jerk up, as if he himself had been slammed with the log. Had they come already? No, couldn't be. Not yet. Please. Nevin turned in the direction from which the sound came, and he saw her. Just one person. One woman. But she wasn't just any one woman. Even from the distance, he recognized her with ease. The tall grey bun she wore her long hair in had been her distinguishing feature since Nevin could remember. Her name was Agave, and she was on the colony council. She dropped one of the 2 planks Nevin had cleaved earlier, and she leant on the second one, eyeing the fence in thought. Why had she come here? Why did she stand here like that? What was her purpose? Move. Talk to her. They had never talked before. But this was about the field, so they would talk. She turned his way as he trudged back to the edge. With each step, he found another word he had to soon push out of his mouth. I know who you are. You are part of the council. I do not care. You cannot. You cannot take flowers from the field. It felt like a year had passed with each sentence. I did not come to take any, Agave answered. Nevin shook his head. Don't manage your words to talk around the truth. You didn't come to take any right now, perhaps, but you planned to. And I will not allow you to do this. He surprised himself at the boldness of his words, and how he hadn't stuttered once. Then he realized why it was so. He wasn't helpless faced with the colony. It was no secret a part of him had been used to create the field, but no one knew what it truly meant. He could hold the key to the colony's greatest treasure. They couldn't risk going against him, not outwardly at least. Not yet. If anyone takes a single flower out of the field, I will leave it to die, he said. He expected Agave to ask the obvious next, but she didn't. Nevertheless, he answered, I would rather return to the temporary than see my mother's work be tarnished. It is not a question for me. The temporary? Is that the name you gave the town below? She asked. What an unnecessary question. It wasn't at all what she was thinking about. She thought she could humanize herself in his eyes by showing interest, so that he would let his guard down and allow them to carry out their insane plan. But that would never happen. Nevin admired progress. He did. Everything they were was the result of human curiosity and ingenuity that made possible the technology used to establish Zelem. The town under the dome, their sprout of life growing on the field of death sprawling over the home planet. Looking at the homeworld itself, today one might feel despair and sorrow. But time was not sentimental. In a couple centuries, the event that took millions of lives might be seen as the catalyst to progress, the best thing to happen to humanity, the wonderful catastrophe which propelled it forward. An unpleasant thought haunted Nevene at times. To rejoice for humanity, you ought to ditch your own humanity. You have to forget the feelings, empathy, forget the suffering of individuals and the suffering of nations. Embrace the collective, serve the hive, become a conduit for knowledge meant only to improve the database of your species. And then pass it on as you wither away, never to see the future anywhere but in your fantasies. And so Zelem, the failed project cut off from civilization, had too been reduced to a stepping stone of progress. A throwaway little place, which admittedly might even continue to exist in its newfound historical irrelevancy. They had played their part. They'd provided data and knowledge which led to new, improved concepts that will grow into impressive inventions somewhere far away from here. Knowing that, accepting that, was liberating to Nevene. He didn't have to think of the collective anymore. None of them in Zelem had to. They'd been removed from the hive, thrown aside, used, freed. What they had left was theirs alone, and they could afford to care about it. Here and now, individually, day by day, month by month. And so he would not sacrifice Viveka's field on the altar of progress. He wouldn't let the colony give in to the human prerogative to always use and discard everything just to keep moving forward. He stepped forth, feeling in power now. You can't dismantle the field and try to mold it into whatever twisted image you have in your minds, he said. It isn't a tool for you to use. Agave shook her head, a very fast motion. She squinted, striving to see something through the sun blinding her. Nevene, these discolorations on your face. She touched her chin. When have they appeared? Do you know what they are? Discolorations. Nevene scoffed and took a step back. It's none of your business. It was the answer he'd been taught to give many, many times before, when they kept on asking about his scars, his vaccinations, his fevers, always making him feel wrong. Agave was taken aback, but she didn't back down. What are they? She asked. It's none of your business. I've said all I had to say. What discolorations? What did she mean? Nevene stopped his hand from rushing up, not in front of this woman. Leave! He screeched, and she raised her hands in defense. I'll leave, she said. Don't worry about the field. I will not do anything without your consent, I swear. She wanted to say something more. Her lips moved a little, but she decided to leave it at that. A victory. But it felt nothing like it.